Namaste, viewers, and welcome to another episode of Amazing Vedas with Radhe or Susan Pfau. Thank you so much, Radhe, for joining us, and thank you also for sharing your journey and especially the turning points. I wanted to pick up on one or two things you said, if you don't mind. The first that I wanted to ask you about, the first thing was, we all have an orientation. Our soul or our psyche has a certain orientation, and it's probably come from several lifetimes if one believes in that sort of thing. The thing I wanted to ask you is because many younger people also who are looking for a path, isn't there some hope? In other words, that if your soul's orientation or if there's an earnestness in that seeking, something in the so called external world, also responds. Like you went to this bookstore, you were looking for something, and suddenly something called out to you, it would seem, from there. So I wanted to first of all ask you that isn't there hope for all of us, as it were, even those of us who haven't got a background or who are not exposed to any particular spiritual tradition, but we have an earnest aspiration. Isn't there hope, almost an assurance, in fact, that the divine is also looking for us?
Yeah, I think that's very, very well said. We all have a soul. We all have a soul that's developing into what Aurobindo and the mother referred to as a psychic being. And even if we're unaware of that soul, even if we are caught up in, all the gunas of nature, the work, the family, making money, all the stuff that we busy ourselves with day in and day out, that soul or that psychic being is still has a subtle influence, whether we know of it or not, whether we feel that we're aware of our calling or not, or the divine, it is always subtly influencing our outer being, physical. So I believe even during those years that I was deeply immersed in more the material world and wealth building and financial services and all, there was that very subtle guide that would bring in sometimes crises, right? Sometimes suddenly a job change or suddenly a loss, and you start re-examining life. What triggered that? So I believe it's always everyone has these. We aren't aware of it. We just think it's it just happened to be that way. It was circumstantial. But if you really look deeply and go within, you'll see and you'll feel that kind of subtle directing of the soul. So absolutely. And as you mentioned the word aspire, it all comes down ultimately for a stronger connection is to aspire to Aurobindo and the mother.
Exactly. Because the reason I'm saying this is that a lot of us, while we were growing up, we felt quite out of place. And I come across younger people who are earnest, they have a quest, and some of them are troubled because they don't fit in. And in fact, it's a blessing. So I'm sort of saying these words to some of our viewers who are looking for answers. And actually, not to fit in can be a blessing. You have to keep that flame of aspiration alive. So, in one of my own experiences as a very young person, I was only 16, and I was on vacation. There was a short vacation. I was in what we used to call in India pre-university. And, something led me to, Tiruvannamalai. I read in some tourist brochure that there was a temple there. And, a whole series of events unfolded. And someone said that, having come so far, you must go to Ramanashram. And how these things get triggered is something so fascinating. But now I'm going to ask you about the secret of the Veda, because one of the things that struck me is how you started with it. I mean, how fortunate, how lucky. Because some of us, I mean, we started with the poetry. I was doing a PhD on mysticism in Indian English poetry, and I began to sort of grapple with Savitri. It was so formidable, and I couldn't make head or tail of it, in fact. And I was only 19, 20, just in graduate school doing my master's. And I said, what is this poem all about? And what is Sri Aurobindo trying to do? And some of the shorter poems are, of course, more accessible. But the point is, it took me so many years, maybe 25, 30 years after I read through The Life Divine, The Synthesis of Yoga, essays on the Gita, all kinds of books of Sri Aurobindo, because I was doing this anthology for Penguin India. So at that time, it was the SABCL, the Sri Aurobindo Birth Centenary Library. I think the volume started, it's sort of coming out earlier, but they coincided with 1972, Sri Aurobindo's 100th birthday, as it were. And the secret of the Veda eluded me, as it were. And I probably got to it only about 8 to 10 years ago. And it literally blew my mind. I think it's one of the greatest feats of scholarship in the last century. And that is because Sri Aurobindo doesn't actually entirely reject the historical critical method, as you know, of the West. And He was a classic scholar, so he had access to the Iliad, the Odyssey, that's Homer, and also uh, to Virgil, the Aeneid, and he was able to see this bigger picture. And in The Secret of the Veda, he says that the what we see today in the Veda is the remnant of a very vast corpus of spiritual wisdom, which was available to many other parts of the world as well. It's only that it's come preserved to us in India, luckily, because of that incredible system of how they memorize these very complex and long texts. Anyhow, but you started with The Secret of the Veda. I mean, how wonderful, how astonishing. And then, as you said, you also came upon Sri Aurobindo's writings on astrology. So, I mean, frankly, that's another area that I know absolutely nothing about. So, if you can just tell us a little bit about, like, what is Vedic astrology and how is it different from, you know, whatever Laura Goodman's sun signs or the weekly, columns you see in Indian newspapers where you follow a slightly different system.
Sure. Well, first of all, many people aren't aware that Sri Aurobindo had a great interest for 7, 8, 9 years of his life in Jyotish and Vedic astrology. And he would not only visit various astrologers to get their readings to see, how accurate, to kind of challenge them, but he also engaged in a deep study of it. And he eventually did his own birth chart and documented in almost 30 pages his own interpretation of his birth chart. There are some, I've been blessed to be able to see parts of that, and parts of it are also out on Incarnate Word and elsewhere where he speaks, addresses some of them. So it's absolutely amazing. And he gets to the point, though, obviously, where he says, well, there's still something beyond the planets. These are vital energies that certainly have their influences on us. So it was not that he did not believe in the power of Jyotish, but as he says, there's something even bigger behind these planets, right? And that's the divine.
Exactly, exactly. In fact, I was just going to say that we know that Jyotish is one of the Vedangas, along with Vyakarana, which is grammar, and Nirukta, and so forth. So it was established as a very important aid or tool to understanding the Veda. And the word itself, correct me if I'm wrong, means Jyoti and Isha, which means in some way either the science of light or the, you know, Lord of light, Isha, or that which gives the light or divine light, if you like. And therefore, as an auxiliary or a limb of the Veda, it was not regarded as some sort of mumbo jumbo, as let's say the scientific temperament nowadays would regard it. In fact, it was aimed at a kind of practical wisdom, which could help us, align with our perhaps our birth chart or the constellations. But as you said, at least from my understanding of The Secret of the Veda, one of the things that I learned from this book is that everything that is outside, the sun, the moon, the stars, also has an equivalent right inside. So when we say, for example, Savitur, that light of higher consciousness. So there's a symbology, of course, in the Veda, but there's also a psychic equivalence, So is that a way to approach the ancient Jyotish as opposed to the modern version?
Well, from my perspective, Jyotish, Ayurveda, Vastu, Hasta, all these ancient science slash arts were given to mankind to help us through the Kali Yuga, right? And they were given not in piecemeal like we use them today, but they were one body of science. At that point, we could hold the vastness of all these arts, of all these sciences, if you will, and in synergy, unlike today where we parse them out and we do a reading here and somebody else does an Ayurvedic consultation or a hasta, they were held together. And what they did so very powerfully is help us understand who we are, help us understand our vasanas, help us understand our samskaras, to be that especially that birth chart. To me, it's a blueprint or a reflection of who we are, and bringing in what's so powerful about Jyotish, which we don't find in Western astrology, although it has its own truth, is the whole dasha bhukti timing systems, right? So now not only can we see sort of the underlying Aurobindo attributed psychological factors to everything, right? To the gods, godheads, everything. And so the same is with the planets and with the birth charts. It shows us that psychological perspective. And if somebody is interested in really understanding kind of it's mainly their outer nature and their tendencies, then if they're open, a birth chart reading, an accurate birth chart reading can be very helpful to them. And my particular interest, and I hope I'm not getting off a little bit, but I was fascinated with how these sciences used to be one. And I was interested in health and healing. And so after 7 or 8 years of practicing Jyotish, I traveled to India and studied under gurus there. I studied, practiced, and studied weekly here. It was very intense. I wanted to start combining. And so this is why I went back to school for a 2-year Ayurvedic consultation or physician certificate, so that I could integrate these two sciences and also use them in health and healing. So beyond just psychological, there's also this health and healing aspect that is part of Jyotish, and especially if you can integrate some or a little of Ayurveda. And so a lot of times, and for a while, I did health readings. What are the kavaigunyas as shown in the birth chart? Kavaigunyas being inherently weak areas. It could be the heart, it could be the lungs. And now we have, which Ayurveda doesn't have, a timing system. When are these going to be at risk? When are the kind of constellations, the planets, the timing going to come to a point where that person has to be aware and pay special attention to their health, or the health of their mother, or the health of the child? It's all shown in that chart. And so, that was my focus for a long time, health, and also this sort of psychological. People would come, I'm on to my 5th marriage. What's happening? Why can't I get along with anyone? And so you could see kind of the underlying vasanas, the patterns. And if they were open and honest, then they could kind of self-reflect and begin to change. Now, again, all of this is just the first step. There is further step with obviously spiritual and the soul and the psyche, but sometimes we are just so enmeshed in our problems and our issues and our challenges and responsibilities that if we could untangle those a little bit and get a little bit of silence, then we're able to go within. So it's sort of a little lamppost, if you will, that will just kind of show you, over here's the door, but a few things that maybe are cluttering the way so you don't see it. So I don't know if that makes sense, Macron, but that's
Oh,
kind of why I dove into it. And I spent a whole year just on my own birth chart. I didn't even believe it. I thought, no, can't be true. Cannot be true. A whole year studying Jyotish, applying it to my own birth chart, going back in time. I ended up going, wow, what a gift. What a gift that we have.
Did your turning point show up in your birth chart?
Of course.
Oh,
Of course.
wow,
Of course it
wow.
had to. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. And had
But at
you,
that
in
point,
a
I
way,
didn't know enough to know where it was showing up. It took years of study and timing and transits and understanding all of this to say, that's what.
oh, wonderful. I think that's a very good note on which to pause before we segue to the, concluding part of, today's discussion. Thank you so much, Radhe, and thank you, viewers, for joining us. Do like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And I hope you find the content useful in your own journey, your journey to self-knowledge and to realization, of course, and also, to help us help not just ourselves, but if not heal the world, at least make it a slightly better place. I guess to paraphrase what Michael Jackson once said. With those words, see you soon. Namaste. Thank you.